Welcome to Moon Castle. Have you ever wondered what you would do if one day your hometown turned into ruins? How would you survive? Today's story is about a group of children who lost everything because of a war. They have no homes, no parents, and all they can do is rely on each other in a shattered city. But even in their darkest days, they never stop protecting each other. Just like the faint stars shining in the night sky. This story is called Starlight in the Ruins. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Chapter 1. The Ruins of War. Ali opened his eyes and found himself curled up behind a collapsed wall, surrounded by shadows and silence. In the distance, he could hear the occasional crackle of gunfire and the heavy rumble of explosions. The sounds echoed through the ruins like distant thunder, filling him with dread. He slowly peeked out, looking over the devastated city that lay before him. This used to be his home, busy and full of life. Less than a year ago, the streets were filled with people and the sounds of street vendors calling out their wares. The fountain in the town square sparkled in the sunlight. Children played games under the shade of the trees, and neighbors gathered in the narrow alleys, sharing their joys and worries. But now, all of that was gone. The street in front of him was buried under a thick layer of dust. A broken bridge stretched across a dry riverbed, standing alone and empty. The wide roads were littered with abandoned cars, most of them smashed, scorched, their windows shattered into tiny shards, their tires twisted and deformed. Here and there, he could see bodies lying in the corners, covered in layers of dust, curled up like forgotten dolls. Ali swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away from the bodies, lowering his head. He knew he couldn't stop here. If he stayed in one place too long, the soldiers would find him. The invading army was stationed all over this ruined city, treating it like their own prize. They'd set up checkpoints on every street and patrolled constantly, weapons in hand. Any adults they found were either taken away as forced labor or dealt with as threats. As for the children, they were usually just shooed away or yelled at to get lost, but they were rarely hunted down as long as they didn't cause trouble or draw attention. The soldiers barely noticed them. Children aren't a threat. Ali remembered hearing a soldier say that coldly one day on the street. And so, the children were left to roam the ruins, forgotten, like stray cats and dogs, scavenging for food and clinging to life. Ali slowly stood up, moving carefully along the edge of the street. He avoided stepping on any loose stones, his footsteps as light as a breeze. Moving quietly through the ruins was a skill he'd picked up over the past few months' war, had taught him how to blend into the shadows, to make himself invisible. Every tiny sound of crunching gravel, every unnecessary breath could bring danger. If he wanted to survive, he had to be cautious. He slipped into the remains of a collapsed building and crouched down, digging through a pile of rubble with his hands. Occasionally, he'd find bits of food here that hadn't been completely destroyed, a piece of stale bread, a hard cracker, maybe even a can of expired food. Every small discovery felt like a lifeline. He didn't find much, but he carefully tucked what he did find into his cloth bag. It was his only possession, a worn bag that his mother had sewn and patched for him, with stitches that still bore her touch. It was Ali's one reminder of warmth, his last connection to the life he'd lost. Every time he looked at that bag, he could almost see his mother's smiling face, her standing in the kitchen with her apron on, humming softly as she cooked for him. "Ali, just hang on a little longer, it'll be okay soon." His mother's gentle voice still echoed in his mind, but she could no longer comfort him. On the day the war began, the thunder of bombs had torn the city apart. Ali remembered that morning. They had been eating breakfast around the table. His mother serving him a steaming bowl of porridge. His older brother teasing him. His sister gently combing his messy hair. Now, those memories felt distant, like they were trapped behind a thick pane of glass, so far away, as if they belonged to someone else's life, or a dream that had faded. He closed his eyes, forcing those memories to the back of his mind. He knew he had to stay alert, to focus on the present. Those memories were too heavy, so heavy they made it hard to breathe. Just then, he heard footsteps approaching from a distance. Instantly on high alert, Ali ducked behind a broken-down truck, carefully peeking out to see who was coming. It was a group of soldiers, dressed in grey uniforms, weapons at their sides, their expressions as cold as stone. They scanned their surroundings with bored, indifferent eyes, kicking aside rubble as they walked down the street. Ali held his breath, staying as still as possible, his heart pounding in his chest like a slow, heavy drum, reminding him to keep silent. The soldiers' footsteps grew fainter and finally disappeared around the corner. Only then did Ali let out a shaky breath, feeling the cold sweat soaking his clothes. He knew that this was just one of many close calls he'd have to face each day. But each time he managed to stay hidden, it felt like walking on the edge of a knife. Once he was sure it was safe, he crawled out from his hiding spot and continued moving forward. He didn't know how much food he'd be able to find, but he had to keep looking. Ever since he'd lost his family and been separated from his friends, surviving had become his only purpose, not for any grand reason, but for the sake of his mother's last words to him. "Stay alive, Ali. No matter what happens, stay alive." It was the last thing his mother had ever told him, and it was what kept him going through the hardships of life in the ruins. He knew his mother would want him to survive, even though the world had grown so cold and desolate. As he moved through the empty streets, he sometimes saw other children. Like him, they wore ragged clothes, their faces smudged with dirt, clutching moldy pieces of bread in their hands. Sometimes the children would meet each other in the ruins, exchanging weary, guarded glances. No one spoke, and no one got too close. But even so, they weren't completely heartless. Sometimes, Ali would share a bit of food he'd found, in exchange for a small smile or a silent nod. These brief moments of cooperation reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone, that in the vast emptiness of the ruins, there was still a faint glimmer of warmth. Ali kept moving, slipping through a maze of crumbling buildings. His steps were light, his gaze steady. He knew he couldn't stop, couldn't give up, even though his home was now a wasteland, and even though he was all alone, he had to keep going. That's the end of chapter 1. In the next part of the story, just when Ali thinks he'll be spending the rest of his days alone, hiding in the ruins, his life begins to change. He meets other children who, like him, have lost their homes, and he even catches a glimpse of a mysterious figure moving through the rubble. What adventures await Ali? Will he and his new friends find a glimmer of hope amid the fires of war? Want to find out what happens next? Don't forget to like and follow, and I'll continue the story of Starlight in the ruins in the next episode. See you then.